Snow blinded her vision, and the cold bit through her thin coat like 1,000 needles. Everyone in Grimwood Creek whispered the legend of Colton Graves, the Blood Mountain Man. They said he was a demon who collected souls, a beast who feasted on the lost. But the town didn't send Abigail Halloway up that jagged ridge to find a legend. They sent her there to die. Betrayed by her own blood and left to freeze, she braced herself for the monster's teeth. Instead, the door swung open, and she found something far more dangerous than death. A man with warm eyes, a hot meal, and a vow of protection that would burn the world down. Stay tuned. This isn't a fairy tale. This is survival. Iron shackles shouldn't have felt colder than the wind, but against Abigail Halloway's wrists, the metal burned like dry ice. She sat on the edge of the buckboard wagon, her boots dangling over the precipice of a muddy wheel track that wound its way up the spine of the Bitterroot Range. Below her, the town of Grimwood Creek looked like a scattering of rotten teeth in a diseased gum line, gray, decaying, and cruel. Mayor Josiah Purvis sat at the reins, his heavy coat pulled tight against his neck. He didn't look back at her. He hadn't looked her in the eye since the gavel fell in the makeshift courthouse 3 days ago. "You're shivering, girl," Purvis grunted, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Save your strength. You'll need it for the negotiations." Negotiations? Abigail's voice cracked. She hadn't had water since yesterday morning. "You call leaving a woman to freeze on a predator's doorstep a negotiation? You're murdering me, Josiah. Call it what it is." Purvis pulled the horses to a halt. The path had become too steep for the wagon. Towering pines, black against the gray sky, loomed over them. This was the boundary. Beyond this point lay the territory of the outcast, the man the locals called the Butcher of Black Peak. "It ain't murder, Abigail," Purvis said, climbing down and trudging through the slush to unlock her cuffs. "It's a transaction. Your father, bless his drunk soul, racked up a debt that the town can't pay. The mountain man controls the water flow from the high pass. He threatened to dam it up if we didn't send him a companion. A wife. He didn't ask for a wife." Abigail spat as the cuffs clicked open. She rubbed her raw wrists. "He asked for tribute. You just decided a woman was cheaper than gold." Purvis didn't answer. He reached into the wagon bed and tossed her a burlap sack. It landed with a dull thud in the snow. Hardtack, dried beef, a blanket. Should last you 2 days. If you haven't charmed him by then, well. He climbed back onto the seat, snapping the reins. The horses whinnied, eager to turn their backs on the ominous peak. "You're sending me to a monster!" Abigail screamed, the wind finally snatching the words from her throat. "Better you than the whole town dying of thirst come summer," Purvis yelled back, already turning the wagon around. "Go on now, Abigail. Don't keep the devil waiting." She watched him leave. The creak of the wheels faded long before the man himself disappeared into the mist. Abigail Halloway stood alone in the silence of the Rockies. She was 22 years old, possessing nothing but the clothes on her back and a spirit that refused to break, even when faced with the impossible. Grimwood Creek had discarded her. Her father, Thomas Halloway, had gambled away their farm and then died of a burst heart, leaving her to inherit his ruin. The town council, led by Purvis, had seized her property within the hour. But that wasn't enough. When the water levels in the creek dropped, a natural occurrence during a dry winter, Purvis had spun a tale about the Blood Mountain Man cursing the water supply. He demands a bride, Purvis had told the terrified townsfolk. A sacrifice to open the waters again. It was a lie. Abigail knew it. Purvis just wanted her gone so there would be no one left to contest the seizure of the Halloway land. Snow began to fall harder, fat flakes that stuck to her eyelashes. She looked up the trail. It was little more than a deer track disappearing into the white void. She could sit here and freeze, or she could climb and face the beast. "If I'm going to die," she whispered to the pines, "I'm going to die standing up." She shouldered the burlap sack and began to walk. Hours bled into an eternity. The air grew thinner, sharper, tasting of metallic ozone. Abigail's legs burned with every step, the deep snow sucking at her boots, trying to drag her down into a cold grave. The sun had long since dipped behind the peaks, plunging the world into a bruised twilight of purple and gray. She had heard the stories of the man who lived up here. Colton Graves. Old Widow Marsden claimed he was a Confederate deserter who had eaten his own platoon to survive a winter in the Shenandoah. The blacksmith swore Graves was half bare, covered in fur, with teeth filed to points. They said he had tripwires made of gut string and that he shot anything that moved on two legs. Abigail stumbled, her knee hitting a jagged rock hidden beneath the powder. She cried out, the sound sharp and lonely. She forced herself up, but her strength was failing. Hypothermia was a seductive enemy. It didn't hurt anymore. It just made her feel heavy, sleepy. Just close your eyes for a minute, her mind whispered. No, her heart roared back. She saw a light. At first, she thought it was a hallucination, a dying spark of her own consciousness. But it remained steady, a square of orange warmth cutting through the swirling white. A cabin. It was massive, built of heavy, dark logs, perched on a flat shelf of rock that overlooked the valley miles below. Smoke, thick and smelling of hickory, poured from a stone chimney. Abigail dragged her body the last 100 yards. The wind was screaming now, a banshee wail that tore at her dress and froze the tears on her cheeks. She reached the heavy oak door. There was no handle, only a thick leather strap. She pounded on the wood. Her fist felt like a block of ice. She couldn't even feel the impact. "Open up," she rasped, her voice failing. "If you're gonna kill me, do it! Don't let the cold take the credit!" Nothing. She hit the door again, harder, leaning her entire body weight against it. The world tilted. Her knees gave way. She slid down the rough wood, curling into a ball on the welcome mat. At least, she thought as the darkness rushed in, Purvis won't see me die. The last thing she heard was the sound of a heavy latch lifting and the groan of hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. Light. That was the first sensation. Not the blinding white of the snow, but a soft, flickering gold. Then came the heat. It washed over her in waves, prickly and intense, thawing the numbness in her extremities. Abigail gasped, her eyes flying open. She was lying on a rug, a bearskin, thick and soft. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast a whole hog. The cabin was vast, smelling of tobacco, pine resin, and stew. Beef stew. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness slammed her back down. Easy. The voice was low, a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't the growl of a beast, but it held the gravel of a man who didn't speak often. Abigail turned her head. Sitting in a high-backed wooden chair by the fire was a mountain. Colton Graves was huge. He had to be 6'4", with shoulders that spanned the width of the window frame behind him. He wasn't wearing a shirt, despite the winter chill. Only heavy suspenders over thermal undershirts that revealed forearms corded with muscle and crisscrossed with white scars. His beard was dark, trimmed but thick, and his hair fell to his shoulders in wild waves. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They weren't the red eyes of a demon. They were blue, piercing, icy, intelligent blue. He was peeling an apple with a knife that looked like it could skin a buffalo in one stroke. "You're him," Abigail whispered. "I'm him," Colton said, not looking up from the apple. A perfect spiral of red skin fell to the floor. "And you're the fool who tried to freeze to death on my porch." "I didn't try," she snapped, a spark of her old fire returning. "I was sent." Colton paused. He looked at her then, really looked at her. His gaze swept over her torn dress, her bruised wrists where the shackles had been, and the hollows of her cheeks. He sliced a piece of apple and held it out on the tip of the knife. "Eat." Abigail hesitated. "Is it poisoned?" Colton snorted, a dry, humorless sound. "If I wanted you dead, woman, I would have left you outside. The storm did a fine job of killing you. I had to drag you back from the edge." She reached out, her hand trembling, and took the apple slice. It was sweet, crisp, and cold. She ate it ravenously. "Who sent you?" Colton asked, standing up. He moved with a surprising grace for a man of his size, walking to the iron pot hanging over the fire. He ladled stew into a wooden bowl. "Mayor Purvis," Abigail said, watching him warily. "The town of Grimwood Creek." Colton turned, the bowl in his hand. His expression darkened, a thunderhead rolling in. "Purvis, that snake oil salesman is still breathing?" "He said you demanded a tribute," Abigail said, pushing herself into a sitting position. She pulled the fur rug tighter around her shoulders. He said you damned the water, that you wanted a wife. Colton froze. He stared at her for a long moment, silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming sound that startled the fire, making the flames jump. A wife? Colton wheezed, shaking his head. I demanded he stop dumping mercury runoff into the lower creek so the elk wouldn't die. I told him if he didn't stop poisoning the land, I'd come down there and dismantle his mining operation brick by brick. He walked over and handed her the bowl of stew. I didn't ask for a bride, little lady, and I sure as hell didn't ask for a half-frozen waif with a death wish. Abigail took the bowl. The warmth seeped into her fingers. So you're not going to eat me? Colton looked at her, his face serious now. He leaned down, placing a hand on the arm of the chair next to her, looming over her. The scent of wood smoke and soap filled her nose. I ain't a monster, despite what they tell you in the valley, he said softly. But you're stuck here now. The pass is snowed in. Storm's dropping 5 feet of powder tonight. You're trapped with the beast of Black Peak for the winter, miss. Halloway, she said, her voice steadying. Abigail Halloway. Well, Miss Halloway. Colton stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the raging white darkness. Eat your stew. You'll need your strength. Because Purvis didn't send you here to be a sacrifice. He sent you here to frame me for your murder. The twist hit Abigail like a physical blow. She lowered the spoon. What? Colton turned back, his eyes grim. Think about it. A helpless woman sent to the mountain. She disappears. Spring comes. They find your body. Or don't. Purvis riles up the town, says the monster killed an innocent girl. Then he brings the U.S. Marshals to hunt me down. He gets my land, he gets my water, and he gets rid of his debt. He walked back to the fire and threw another log on. Sparks flew up the chimney. He wants a war, Colton said, his voice low and dangerous. And by bringing you here, he just started one. The cabin was divided by shadows. The firelight couldn't reach the far corners, where bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters like sleeping bats. Abigail finished the stew, scraping the bottom of the bowl. Her stomach felt full for the first time in weeks, but her mind was racing. She wasn't a sacrifice. She was bait. Where do I sleep? She asked, breaking the silence. Colton pointed to a heavy wooden door on the far side of the room. My room. It has a lock. Use it. Where will you sleep? Here. By the fire. He threw the bearskin rug onto a padded bench. I don't sleep much anyway. Abigail stood up, her legs still wobbly. She walked to the door he indicated, but stopped with her hand on the latch. She looked back at him. He was cleaning his rifle now, the metal gleaming in the firelight. He looked lethal, a weapon forged by solitude and violence. Yet, he had given her his bed. Why? She asked. Colton didn't look up. Why what? Why help me? You could have just let me freeze and thrown my body off a cliff. Purvis would have his war regardless. Why feed me? Why give me your room? Colton paused, his cloth freezing over the rifle barrel. He looked at the flames, his expression unreadable. Because I knew your father, he said quietly. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. You knew Thomas? I served with him. Gettysburg, Colton said. He was a drunk and a fool, but he carried me 3 miles with a bullet in my leg when everyone else left me for dead. I pay my debts, Miss Halloway. Even the ones owed to ghosts. He looked at her then, and for a second, the hardness in his eyes softened. Go to sleep. Bolt the door. If you hear anything outside tonight, wolves, wind, or men, don't open it. The mountain has eyes. Abigail nodded, swallowed hard, and slipped into the room. It was sparse but clean. A large bed with a quilt made of patches, a wash basin, and a single window with heavy shutters. She bolted the door as instructed. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress groaning under her weight. She was alive. Against all odds, she was alive. But as she lay down, listening to the wind batter the cabin walls, she realized the danger hadn't passed. It had just changed shape. She was trapped in a snowbound cabin with a man who was preparing for war, while a town below waited for her to die. Outside, in the howling dark, a shadow moved against the tree line. It wasn't a wolf. It was a man on horseback, watching the cabin through a brass telescope. Down in the valley, the chess pieces were moving. But up here, on Blood Mountain, the king had just found his queen. And Colton Graves was right. War was coming. Morning didn't break on the mountain so much as the darkness simply turned a lighter shade of gray. For 3 weeks, the blizzard hammered the cabin, burying the world in 10 feet of snow. The wind was a constant physical weight, pressing against the logs, groaning like a dying animal. Inside, the cabin became a separate universe, a cage of warmth and tension. Abigail Holloway learned quickly that survival wasn't a passive act. It was a chore. It was scraping the ash from the hearth, hauling water from the indoor pump that drew from a deep well, and skinning the rabbits Colton brought in from his trapline before the storm fully hit. Colton spoke little. He moved around her like a wolf circling a campfire, wary, silent, and imposing. He spent his hours sharpening his knives, oiling his Winchester 1873, and staring into the fire with eyes that saw ghosts she couldn't name. But the silence was beginning to crack. On the 10th day, Abigail found a straight razor and a bowl of soap on the washstand. Colton was sitting by the fire, rubbing a hand over the thick, unruly growth of his beard. He looked tired. The shadows under his eyes were dark bruises. "You look like a wild animal," Abigail said, breaking the quiet. She was mending a tear in his flannel shirt, the needle flashing in the firelight. Colton grunted. "Fits the reputation." "It hides the man," she countered. She set the shirt down and stood up. "Let me do it." Colton looked up, his brow furrowed. "Do what? Shave you." "You can't see what you're doing in this light, and your hand shakes when you hold the blade near your throat." It was true. She had noticed it. His hands were steady as rocks when holding a rifle, but when he performed delicate tasks, a tremor, likely a souvenir from the war, betrayed him. Colton hesitated. Trust was a currency he didn't spend, but he nodded slowly, leaning his head back against the chair. Abigail mixed the lather, the scent of sandalwood rising in the heat. She stepped between his spread knees, the intimacy of the position sending a flush of heat up her neck that had nothing to do with the fire. She applied the foam, her fingers brushing the rough skin of his jaw. He closed his eyes. "My father," Abigail whispered as she pulled the skin taut, bringing the razor down in a smooth scrape. "He used to tell me that a man who doesn't groom himself has given up on tomorrow. Maybe I have," Colton rumbled, the vibration traveling through her fingertips. "You haven't," she said firmly. "A man who gives up doesn't stock a larder for winter. A man who gives up doesn't save a woman sent to die." She worked in silence for a while, the only sound the scrape of steel on stubble and the crackle of the logs. As the beard fell away, a face emerged, a strong jaw, a cleft chin, and a scar that ran from his ear to his collarbone, jagged and white. When she finished, she wiped his face with a hot cloth. Colton opened his eyes. They were blue, intense, and focused entirely on her lips. For a moment, the air in the cabin felt thin, charged with electricity. Abigail's breath hitched. Colton reached out, his large hand capturing her wrist. He didn't squeeze. He just held her there, anchoring her. "Why didn't you run?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "The second day, the storm broke for an hour. You could have taken the sled. You could have tried for the pass." "And go where?" Abigail asked softly. "Purvis has my home. The town thinks I'm dead." And she paused, looking down at his scarred hand holding hers. "And I feel safer here with the monster than I ever did in Grimwood Creek." Colton let her go abruptly, standing up and moving to the window. The rejection stung, but Abigail saw the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't rejecting her. He was restraining himself. "You shouldn't trust me," he said, staring at the snow. "I've killed men, Abigail, more than I can count. Not just in the war, after. Did they deserve it?" Colton turned, his silhouette framed by the gray light. "Every single one." He walked over to a heavy iron chest at the foot of his bed, the one place he had forbidden her to touch. He fished a key from his pocket, unlocked it, and pulled a leather-bound folio. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy slap. "Read it." Abigail walked over, her hands trembling. She opened the folio. Inside was a deed, a land deed. The Holloway farm, 150 acres. Water rights included. Her eyes widened. "This is my father's deed. Purvis showed me the foreclosure papers. He said the bank held the title. Purvis lied, Colton said, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. Thomas didn't gamble the farm away. He knew Purvis was cooking the books at the bank. He mailed the deed to me 3 days before he died. He told me that if his heart gave out, I was to hold it for you until you were ready to fight. Abigail felt the room spin. He didn't lose it? It's still mine? It's yours, Colton said. And that's why Purvis wants you dead. As long as you're breathing, you're the legal owner of the only water access to the valley. If you die, the land goes to auction, and Purvis buys it for pennies. Rage, hot and blinding, surged through Abigail. Tears pricked her eyes, not of sadness, but of fury. All the shame she had felt. The shame of her father's supposed gambling, the shame of being destitute, was a lie manufactured by a greedy little man in a cheap suit. He murdered him, Abigail whispered, the realization settling like lead in her stomach. My father's heart didn't just burst. Purvis did something. Likely, Colton agreed. He took a swig of the whiskey. And that's why we aren't just surviving this winter, Abigail. We're preparing. For what? Colton set the glass down. The metal rang against the wood. Retribution. The blizzard broke 2 weeks later. The silence that followed was deafening. The sun emerged, blindingly bright, reflecting off a world scrubbed clean by white. The pines bowed under the weight of the snow, looking like hunched old men. Get dressed, Colton commanded before the sun had fully crested the peaks. Wear the wool trousers I gave you. The dress will get you killed. Abigail didn't argue. She pulled on the oversized trousers, belting them tight, and donned the heavy buffalo coat. When she stepped out onto the porch, the air was so crisp it felt like inhaling broken glass. Colton was waiting. He had 2 rifles leaning against the rail. He tossed one to her. It was heavy, the wood stock smooth and cold. Do you know how to use that? I've shot rabbits, Abigail said, checking the chamber. With a varmint rifle. This feels like a cannon. It's a Winchester .4440, Colton said. It hits hard. Today, you learn to shoot to kill. They trudged through the snow to a clearing about 200 yards from the cabin. Colton set up targets. Melons he had preserved in the root cellar, placed on stumps. Purvis won't come himself, Colton explained, his voice low. He's a coward. He'll send hired guns. Men who don't care who you are, only what you're worth. You need to stop thinking of them as people. If they come up this mountain, they are targets. For 3 hours, the valley echoed with the crack of gunfire. Abigail's shoulder ached, bruised blue from the recoil, but she didn't complain. She learned to breathe, to squeeze the trigger between heartbeats, to lead the target. By noon, she was hitting the melons consistently. Good, Colton said, nodding. It was the highest praise she had received. Now what? Abigail asked, rubbing her shoulder. Now we check the perimeter. They strapped on snowshoes, tennis racket-shaped frames of ash and rawhide, and began a wide circle around the cabin. The snow was deep, covering the treacherous rocks. They were a mile out, near the ridge that overlooked the switchback trail, when Colton stopped dead. He held up a fist. Abigail froze, mimicking his stance. Colton crouched, brushing away the top layer of snow near a tree trunk. He revealed a patch of yellow snow and the distinct impression of a boot. A heavy, hobnailed boot. Not a moccasin, not a riding boot. A military-issue boot. Fresh? Abigail whispered. Yesterday, Colton said, his eyes scanning the tree line. Someone was watching the cabin while the storm was clearing. He stood up, unslinging his rifle. We're being hunted. A crack, sharp like a snapping branch, echoed through the canyon. Colton moved with a speed that defied his size. He tackled Abigail, driving her into the snowbank, just as a bullet shattered the bark of the pine tree where her head had been a second before. Stay down! Colton roared. Another shot rang out, kicking up a spray of snow inches from his boot. The report was distant, coming from the high ridge to the east. A sniper. Colton rolled, bringing his rifle up. Crawl to the rocks, go! Abigail scrambled on her elbows and knees, the snow burning her face. She threw herself behind a granite outcropping. Colton slid in beside her a second later, breathing hard. He's about 400 yards out. High ground, Colton said, analyzing the terrain instantly. He's got a Sharps rifle. Long range. He's pinning us down. Who is it? A pro. Colton growled. Purvis must have hired out of state. Maybe Pinkertons, maybe a regulator. They were trapped. If they moved, the sniper would pick them off. If they stayed, night would fall, and they would freeze. I'm going to draw his fire, Colton said, checking his ammunition. No, Abigail grabbed his arm. That's suicide. It's tactics, Colton corrected. I'll break left, toward the timber. He'll track me. That gives you a shot. Can you see that twisted cedar up on the ridge? The one that looks like a claw? Abigail peeked over the rock. I see it. He's behind the boulder just to the right of it. When I move, he'll lean out to take the shot. You put a bullet in him. Colton, I can't. I've only shot melons. Colton grabbed her face in his hands. His gloves were rough, but his touch was desperate and firm. You are Abigail Halloway. You survived the blizzard. You survived the betrayal. You are not a victim. You are the woman who holds the deed to this mountain. Now, aim true. He didn't wait for an answer. Colton vaulted over the rock, sprinting in a zigzag pattern through the deep snow, a massive, moving target. Crack. The sniper fired. The bullet tore through the tail of Colton's coat. Abigail rested her rifle on the granite. She looked through the iron sights. She saw the movement on the ridge, a flash of a brown duster, the glint of a barrel. The man was adjusting, tracking Colton. She took a breath. She thought of her father dying alone. She thought of Purvis smiling as he put the shackles on her. Between heartbeats, she squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked hard. Up on the ridge, the figure jerked violently backward. The rifle fell from his hands, tumbling down the cliff face. The man followed a second later, his body limp, sliding down the shale until he hit a snowbank and lay still. Silence returned to the mountain. Colton stopped running. He looked up at the ridge, then back at the rock where Abigail was hiding. He raised his hand in a salute. They approached the body carefully, rifles raised. The man was dead. The bullet had caught him in the shoulder, shattering the collarbone and likely hitting an artery. He was dressed in heavy wool and leather. Colton rifled through the man's pockets. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and a heavy pouch of coins. Gold, Colton said, weighing the pouch. Spanish gold. This isn't Purvis's money. Purvis deals in banknotes and silver. He unfolded the paper. It was a wanted poster. Wanted. Colton Graves. Deed OR alive. Bounty. $5,000. I sessued BY. He United Railrad Consortium. Colton's face went pale. It's not just the water, he whispered. Purvis sold the land rights to the railroad. They want to blow a tunnel through this mountain. That's why he needs the deed. That's why he needs us both dead. Abigail looked at the dead man, then at the vast, beautiful wilderness around them. If the railroad comes, they'll destroy everything. They'll try, Colton said, his voice hardening into steel. He looked at Abigail, and there was a new respect in his eyes, a partnership forged in gunpowder. We can't stay in the cabin, Colton said. Now that they've sent a scout, the heavy hitters will follow. We have to go on the offensive. How? Abigail asked. We're going to Grimwood Creek, Colton said, turning to look down into the valley. But we aren't going down the trail. We're going to take the mines. The mines? They're collapsed. Everyone knows that. Not all of them, Colton said, a dark smile touching his lips. There's a back door into hell, Abigail, and we're going to kick it open. The entrance to the Lost Dutchman mine wasn't on any map in the Grimwood Creek surveyor's office. It was a fissure in the rock, hidden behind a waterfall that had frozen into a curtain of blue ice. Colton led the way, carrying a lantern that cast long, dancing shadows against the damp walls. The air inside was stale, smelling of earth, copper. My father showed me this. Colton's voice echoed. Back before the war. It runs 3 miles under the ridge and comes out in the basement of the old livery stables. Abigail followed close behind. The darkness felt oppressive, heavy. Why didn't you use this to get supplies? Why let the town think you were trapped? Fear is a better wall than stone, Colton replied. Let them think I'm a ghost on a mountain. Keeps the curious kids away. They walked for hours. The tunnel was treacherous, rotting support beams, sudden drops into black pits, and the constant drip of water. As they walked, Colton began to talk. Really talk. "I didn't desert," he said suddenly. The sound of his boots on the stone was rhythmic. The stories they tell. About me eating my men. Abigail didn't interrupt. "We were cut off. Shenandoah Valley. Union forces had us pinned in a box canyon. It was winter, like this one. We starved for 3 weeks. My lieutenant, he wanted to surrender. But the captain, he was a fanatic. He shot the lieutenant. Then he started shooting the men who wouldn't charge a Gatling gun nest with bayonets." Colton stopped. He held the lantern up, illuminating a wall of quartz crystals that glittered like diamonds. "I killed the captain," Colton said softly, "to save the rest of the boys. But the army didn't see it that way. They called it mutiny. They called it murder. I ran. I've been running ever since." He turned to Abigail. The lantern light reflected in his blue eyes, showing the depth of his pain. "I'm not a hero, Abigail. I'm a man who killed his commanding officer." Abigail stepped forward. She placed a hand on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it beating. Slow, strong. "You're a man who saved his friends," she said, "and you're saving me. That's all I need to know." Colton looked at her, the barriers finally crumbling. He dropped the lantern. It didn't break, but it cast the light upward, illuminating their faces. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a collision, a release of weeks of fear, anger, and longing. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her close, while her arms wrapped around his neck, holding on for dear life. It tasted of danger and hope. When they broke apart, breathless, Colton rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," he rasped, "if we survive, I'm not letting you go." "You know that, right? I'm not asking to be let go," Abigail replied. Colton picked up the lantern. "Come on, we have a war to start." They reached the end of the tunnel an hour later. A wooden barricade blocked the way. Colton used a crowbar he had brought to pry the rotting planks loose. They stepped out into a dusty, spiderweb-filled cellar. The smell of horses and hay filtered down from above. They were in the livery stable. It was night. Through the cracks in the floorboards above, they could see light and hear voices. "I'm telling you, Purvis," a gruff voice said. "The sheriff, undoubtedly." "The scout didn't check in. Graves got him." "Then send more!" Purvis's voice was high and shrill. "The railroad rep is coming tomorrow at noon to sign the deal. If that girl is still alive, and she walks into this town, the deal is off! I need that deed!" "We can't go up there in the dark," the sheriff argued. "It's suicide." "Then burn it," Purvis snapped. "Take the cannon from the town square, haul it up to the ridge, shell the cabin, bury them in an avalanche. I don't care how you do it. Just erase them." Abigail and Colton exchanged a look. "A cannon?" Abigail whispered. "They're going to bring the mountain down," Colton said, his jaw tightening. "We have until dawn. What do we do?" Colton checked his revolver. "We don't wait for them to come to us. We take the fight to Purvis. Tonight, there are 20 men out there," Abigail hissed. "We're 2. "Make that 3, a voice said from the shadows of the cellar. Colton spun around, weapon raised. An old man stepped out from behind a stack of hay bales. He had one eye and a wooden leg, leaning on a crutch. It was Old Man Jedediah, the town drunk. But in his hand, he held a double-barreled shotgun. "Jedediah?" Abigail gasped. "Miss Abigail!" The old man nodded. He looked at Colton. "I saw you come out of the grate. I figured only one man knows about the tunnels. You gonna turn us in, Jed?" Colton asked, his thumb on the hammer. "Turn in the man who leaves fresh venison on my porch every winter without asking for a dime?" Jedediah spat. "Hell no. Besides, Purvis foreclosed on my daughter's house last week. I got a score to settle. Can you ride?" Colton asked. "I can shoot better than I can walk." Jedediah grinned, revealing a lack of teeth. "Good," Colton said, "because we're going to crash a party." The town of Grimwood Creek was asleep, buried under the silence of a winter night, but the lights in the Golden Nugget Saloon were blazing. This was Mayor Purvis's headquarters. Through the frosted glass windows, laughter and the clinking of glasses drifted out into the cold street. They were celebrating a victory they hadn't yet won. Colton, Abigail, and Jedediah stood in the shadows of the alleyway across the street. "Here's the play," Colton whispered, his breath pluming in the air. "Jed, you take the livery loft. You've got the high ground. Don't shoot unless you see a badge or a gun aimed at us. We don't want to hurt the townsfolk." "I'll keep their heads down," Jedediah promised, patting his shotgun before limping away into the darkness. Colton turned to Abigail. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy Colt Peacemaker. He placed it in her hand. "Purvis is in there with the railroad rep, a man named Sterling. They're signing the prelims tonight. You're going to walk in there." "Me?" Abigail's eyes widened. "You're the ghost," Colton said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Walk in the front door. Let them see you. Purvis will panic. When he does, he'll make a mistake. I'll come in through the back. And if they shoot me on sight?" "They won't," Colton said, his voice fierce, "because I'll be watching every move. Trust me." Abigail took a deep breath, gripping the cold steel of the revolver. "I trust you." She stepped out of the alley. She pulled the buffalo coat tight, her hair wild from the wind, looking every bit the revenant returning from the grave. She walked to the saloon doors. She pushed them open. The noise inside didn't die instantly. It tapered off, wave by wave, as heads turned. The piano player stopped mid-chord. A card game froze. At the far end of the room, near the pot-belly stove, Mayor Purvis was raising a glass of champagne with a rotund man in a fine silk suit. Purvis saw her. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. "Abigail?" he squeaked, his face draining of blood. "But the storm, the beast." "The beast didn't want me, Josiah," Abigail said, her voice ringing clear in the silent room. She walked forward, the crowd parting for her like water. She looked taller, stronger than the girl who had left in shackles. "And the storm just made me cold. It didn't make me dead. This is impossible," Purvis stammered, looking around for his sheriff. "She's delirious! Sheriff! Arrest this woman! She's trespassing." "Trespassing?" Abigail laughed, a cold, sharp sound. "On whose land?" "This town stands on the Halloway claim, and I have the deed." She slammed the leather folio onto the bar counter. Mr. Sterling, the railroad man, picked up his monocle. "What is the meaning of this, Purvis? You told me the Halloway line was extinguished. You said you had clear title." "I do! She's a liar!" Purvis screamed, sweat beading on his forehead. "She's a witch! She conspired with the mountain man! Sheriff, shoot her!" The sheriff stood up from a corner table, his hand hovering over his gun. "Now, Miss Halloway, you just calm down." Click. The sound of a hammer cocking echoed from the back of the room. Colton Graves stepped out from the shadows of the rear hallway. He looked massive in the dim light, the Winchester resting casually on his shoulder, his blue eyes scanning the room with predatory calm. "Sheriff," Colton rumbled, "you draw that iron, and you'll never draw another breath." Panic erupted. Men scrambled away from the tables. "It's the butcher!" someone screamed. "Stay seated!" Colton barked. The command was so authoritative that half the room sat back down instantly. "Colton Graves," Purvis sneered, though his voice trembled. "You fell for the trap. Now I have you both. Boys!" Purvis snapped his fingers. 3 men, hired guns sitting at the bar, spun around, drawing their weapons. Boom! The upper window of the saloon shattered inward as Jedediah fired a warning shot from the livery across the street into the ceiling. Plaster rained down on the mercenaries. "Next one takes your ear off!" Jedediah's voice yelled from outside. The distraction was all Colton needed. He didn't shoot. He swung the butt of his rifle, cracking the nearest mercenary across the jaw. The man crumbled. The second gunman fired, but Abigail was faster. She didn't shoot to kill. She fired at the floor near his feet. The wood splintered, and the man jumped back, tripping over a spittoon. Colton disarmed the third man, twisting the pistol from his grip and shoving him over the bar. In 10 seconds, the threat was neutralized. The room was deadly silent again. Colton walked toward Purvis. The mayor backed up until he hit the wall. "You wanted a war, Josiah," Colton said, stopping inches from the trembling man. "You sent a girl to die to cover your crimes. You poisoned the water. You tried to sell this town out from under the people who built it." Colton turned to the crowd. He sold the land to the railroad for a tunnel. He wasn't going to pay your debts. He was going to evict every single one of you once the ink was dry. The townsfolk turned their eyes to Purvis. The anger in the room shifted. It wasn't directed at the monster on the mountain anymore. "Is this true?" the blacksmith asked, standing up. "Business!" Purvis cried. "It's just business! Progress! It's over," Abigail said, stepping up beside Colton. She looked at Mr. Sterling. "The deal is off. The Holloway land is not for sale. Not now. Not ever." Sterling looked at Purvis, looked at the gun in Abigail's hand, and then looked at the deed. He buttoned his jacket. "I believe I have been misled. Good evening to you, Miss Holloway, Mr. Graves." He walked out. Purvis slumped to the floor, defeated. The sheriff looked at Colton, then slowly took the handcuffs from his belt and walked toward the mayor. "Josiah Purvis," the sheriff sighed. "I think we need to have a talk about those bank ledgers." Colton looked at Abigail. The adrenaline was fading, leaving them standing in the center of the saloon, surrounded by the people who had ostracized them. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine," Abigail said, holstering the pistol. She looked at the faces around her. Widow Marsden, the baker, the shopkeep. They looked ashamed. They looked down at their boots. "Let's go home," Abigail said. "Home?" Colton asked. "The mountain," she said. "That's home." Spring didn't arrive in the Rockies with a polite knock. It kicked the door down. It came in a roar of white water, crashing through the thaw-swollen creeks, in the cracking of river ice, and in the sudden, violent bloom of wildflowers that painted the gray slopes in riots of purple and gold. The silence that had defined the winter was replaced by the chaotic music of life returning to a place that had been left for dead. The Holloway farm, once a skeleton of rotting wood and bad memories, was alive again. But it wasn't just the land that was healing. For the last 3 weeks, the road up from Grimwood Creek had seen a steady parade of wagons. The townsfolk, burdened by the guilt of their complicity and the shame of having let a young woman face the winter alone, had come to make amends. They didn't offer flowery speeches or tearful apologies. Folks in the territory weren't built for that. Instead, they offered sweat. Abigail stood on the newly reinforced porch, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She watched as Elias, the town blacksmith, hammered a new hinge onto the barn door. His strokes were heavy and rhythmic, a form of penance in iron. Near the garden patch, Widow Marsden was on her knees in the mud, planting rows of hardy kale and potatoes, her back bent in silent labor. They were rebuilding what Purvis had tried to destroy, brick by brick, board by board. The fear of the Blood Mountain Man had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, reverent respect. They no longer looked at the ridge and saw a monster's den. They saw a fortress that had withstood the corruption of their own mayor. But Abigail's eyes weren't on the townspeople. They were fixed on the figure working the south pasture. Colton Graves was driving fence posts into the soft, dark earth. He had stripped off his heavy coat and shirt, working only in his undershirt and suspenders. The sun beat down on his shoulders, highlighting the map of scars that told the story of his violent past. Yet, as Abigail watched him, she realized the tension that used to carry him. The coiled, wolf-like wariness was gone. He wasn't fighting the land anymore. He was tending it. She poured a glass of cold lemonade from a pitcher sweating in the afternoon heat and walked down the steps. The grass was high enough to brush against her ankles, lush and green, fed by the very water Colton had fought to protect. When she ran, he was wiping sweat from his brow with a forearm. He stopped hammering and leaned on the maul, his chest heaving slightly. He looked at her, and the blue eyes that had once frozen her with their intensity were now warm, crinkled at the corners with a newfound lightness. "Fence line is finished," Colton said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. "Cattle can graze the upper pasture by Tuesday. The grass is sweet up there this year." "You work too hard, Colton," Abigail said, handing him the glass. "The sun is high, and you've been out here since dawn. The war is over. You can rest." Colton took the glass, his large, rough fingers brushing against hers. He drank the lemonade in one long, thirsty swallow, the condensation dripping onto his hand. "A man needs a purpose," he said, handing the glass back. He looked out over the valley, toward the town that looked like a scattering of pebbles far below. Speaking of purpose, The town council rode up while you were checking the bread. The sheriff is retiring. Abigail raised an eyebrow, a playful smirk touching her lips. Let me guess. They want the Butcher of Black Peak to wear the badge? Colton chuckled, a sound that had become more frequent in the last month. They asked. Said they needed a man who doesn't flinch when the shooting starts. Said they wanted law and order. And what did you tell them? Abigail asked, stepping closer. Colton turned his gaze back to her. The humor faded, replaced by a fierce, grounding intensity. I told them I already have a full-time job. Oh? Abigail teased, though her heart began to hammer against her ribs. And does this job pay well? It pays in peace, Colton said softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. And it lasts a lifetime. He held out his hand. Sitting in his calloused palm was a ring. It wasn't a store-bought trinket from the East. It was silver, hand-hammered and imperfect, set with a piece of raw turquoise that was as blue as the winter sky. I found the stone in the mine, Colton said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Where we hid. Where we decided to fight. I made the setting myself last night in the forge. Abigail stared at the ring, her vision blurring with sudden tears. It was beautiful because it was rough. It was strong. It was them. I'm not a gentle man, Abigail, Colton continued, stepping into her space, his presence encompassing her like the mountain itself. I have nightmares. I have scars. I'm not the hero in the storybooks. I never asked for a hero, Abigail whispered, looking up into his face. I asked for a partner. I'm a difficult woman, Colton Graves. I'm stubborn, I have a temper, and I will never let you win an argument. Good, Colton grinned, the expression transforming his face. Because I'm not leaving this mountain, and I'm not leaving you. He took her left hand, his grip firm and warm. He slid the silver band onto her finger. It fit as if it had been there since the day she was born. Will you stay? He asked. Not as a refugee, not as a survivor, but as my wife? Try and make me leave, she answered. Colton didn't wait. He dropped the maul and swept her up into his arms, lifting her feet off the ground. Abigail laughed, a pure, joyous sound that echoed off the canyon walls, mixing with the rush of the creek and the wind in the pines. He kissed her then, deep and searing, a promise sealed in the sunlight. They stood there for a long time as the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the valley. They were no longer the outcast and the sacrifice. They were the masters of the high country. The West was still wild. The winters would still be hard. But up here, on the ridge where the eagles flew, they had built something that no railroad baron, no corrupt mayor, and no blizzard could ever tear down. They had built a home. And that, my friends, is how Abigail Halloway and Colton Graves turned a death sentence into a destiny. They proved that sometimes the monsters we fear are just guardians in disguise, and the real villains wear silk suits and smile to your face. If this story warmed your heart or kept you on the edge of your seat, please do me a huge favor. Smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and tells me you want more stories like this. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a saga. What did you think of Abigail's choice to stay on the mountain? Would you have forgiven the town? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your fires burning. Thanks for watching.